Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for October 13th, 2015. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined by John Markley online. Welcome, John.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
It's good to have you. And you know, for folks that aren't perhaps already familiar, John Markley works on our mobility team in terms of security, and I think you'll be talking a little bit about some activities related to protecting iOS platforms. So we have John Hogoboom here.
The other John.
Yes.
Besides John Markley, I'm the other John.
Yes, we do have the other John. And Matt Kaiser, welcome.
Hey, Ryan, how's it going?
It's going well, thanks. And I'm Brian Rexroad. And I guess, first of all, what we would like to do is highlight that this is October 2015 here, is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And so later on in the show, we're going to talk through some cybersecurity quiz questions. You know, I'd like to call your attention to the DHS website that basically designates National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And in the spirit of that, you know, just last week, we had our own cybersecurity conference. Now, I'm not sure how many folks that watch this program are familiar with that, but this is getting to be a decent sized gathering. It's a free conference. It was available online during the week, so I think we had on the order of thousands of folks participating online, and we also had on the order of about 1,000 folks participating at, where it was the Marriott Marquis in Times Square. So very good conference. I thought it was pretty good. You know, for ThreatTraq, we had the opportunity to hand out these little tissues. No, they're actually, microfiber cloths.
Yes.
And
this was really the highlight of the entire security conference, was the opportunity to come see us at the ThreatTraq booth and talk
and obtain a highly prized, very rare microfiber cloth with our faces on it.
Right. So we have a bunch of these. I'm trying to hold up here. These things that are hard to get control of. So in any case, we handed out a bunch of those. We have some remaining still, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So folks are interested in these. Send us a note. We'll figure out a way to get one to you.
Send us a question, and if we answer it on the show.
Oh, there we go.
All right. We'll definitely send you one.
So, but I thought it'd be worthwhile to just take a few moments and kind of highlight some of the things from the conference. So Matt, we'll go to you first. And what captured your interest?
Well, my favorite talk was Melanie Ensign's talk. Melanie works for Facebook, and she actually used to work for AT&T, so we're very familiar with her. We're a big fan of her. And she had a talk on InfoSec's reputation. I think the general gist of the talk was that today we tend to get our message across about why security is important using what amounts to scare tactics. You know, getting people worried about security. And there are other ways, and Melanie outlined a couple of those, and her approach to making people feel good about fixing the security problems that we have. So I like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And you know, I think the other aspect of this perhaps is that, I think she quoted Dan Kaminsky, and because he was in a discussion and pointed out that now in cybersecurity everybody is in the room. So it's not enough to talk about the techno jargon. Everybody else has to be able to understand the concepts around cybersecurity, and making that translation, building a relationship, is an important part of it. So good observation there, Matt. You know, I think one of the things that, again, building relationship, one of the things that sort of I identified with is John Gannon's presentation. Now, John Gannon is on our legal counsel. He helps us with our cybersecurity things. You know, I remember when cybersecurity was really a technical focus. You know, how do you keep the hackers out? How do you detect them? Things like that. But now there are more significant legal ramifications, responsibilities to uphold protection of information. And so he was talking about how to build that relationship between your legal counsel and the security practitioners. And you find this?
I find this amusing because I'm a little partial to it, because I might have had a name shout out to myself in that talk.
Oh,
so
no kidding.
I'll take it back. I'm actually tied as to which one's my favorite. So.
Yeah. Okay, very good. So anyway, I thought that was a very good talk as well. John Markley, what are your thoughts?
Well, it was a very good conference. I remember Mr. Donovan, who of course was well placed here in the company to see, the big picture, did a nice talk about some of the challenges coming up in the future. In particular, he pointed out that, that the adversaries are getting a lot more aggressive, and, and our footprint is so much bigger on what they can attack, so the network's got to keep changing. We have more of the Internet of Things, more nodes, more issues, and with these more aggressive attackers, we just got to increase our our actions here.
And I thought it was really good that John Donovan actually came to the conference and spoke in person. He is basically responsible for AT&T's technology development and operations activities, so has a really significant responsibility from a technical standpoint and is a very strong advocate for cybersecurity. So that's a very promising thing, and it was good that he was able to be here. John Hogoboom, what did you find?
Well,
other than
myself
meeting
being
the
at the
folks
show,
there,
I liked Ed Amoroso's talk, our boss, Chief Security Officer for AT&T. He gave a talk on the 10 habits of highly successful CISOs. Not that I'm a CISO myself, but actually it really, these 10 points really applied kind of universally across the landscape. You could really take some points from this. And the number one, which is probably the most provocative that we all kind of gripped onto, was that number one was encourage mischief, which basically means not necessarily that you want to do anything malicious, but you want to be able to encourage that kind of creative hacking type thinking within your organization, so that you have your people thinking about ways that things could be hacked and thinking kind of outside the box around problems and things that maybe people haven't thought about before. Also, I forget which one, we have a handy dandy card so we can refer to it that was handed out at the conference, but number 4 takes pride in playing defense, which is kind of the counterpoint of, it's really easy to find that one vulnerability and exploit it. But as security defenders like ourselves, the really hard thing to do is to defend against all of these different points of attack that could be leveraged, and being able to recognize when they're being exploited. So
I agree
really
thoroughly. So finding one hole versus protecting all the holes, certainly it's a higher technical challenge, but I also think it's a higher moral ground to be in a defensive mode than it is to be in the attacker mode.
I think Ed did take a point of saying that, he's no longer impressed if you can break into something.
Right.
Show me someone who's willing to do the defensive side. That impresses him.
Right. It tends to be a little less glamorous in today's time.
Certainly.
Remember when security research was all focused around creating security solutions, and it seems like all the research, all the contests are around finding ways to break systems.
Right.
It's just that's perhaps something along the lines of what Melanie was talking about. Let's find a way to make it a more positive activity.
I think he said even like offense is easy, defense is hard.
Yep. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So anyway, if you didn't get an opportunity to check the AT&T Cybersecurity Conference out when it was online, or when it was, actually visiting the program, the videos will be posted. I don't actually have a time when they're going to be posted, but there will be video program posted. I think you still have to register for the conference to get access to the video, but I think it's certainly well worth your time to take a look at that. So let's go on. And first item here, John Hogoboom.
Yes.
The other John. So first of all, we want to pay attention to what we're doing in social media, and I think you have a good example why.
Right. So, and we've talked about this type of thing before. So this particular one, actually we might have even talked about this case before, because this is not necessarily a new thing. However, SecureWorks, they put out a new article that kind of goes into some pretty good depth on this actor set. They call this actor set TG2889, which is just their numbering convention, but it's a Iranian-based hacking group. And what they're doing is they're using LinkedIn. They have 2 types of personas on there. They're creating fake profiles, and they have what are called leader profiles, and then they have supporter profiles. So the leaders are ones that are like fully fledged out profiles of individuals that are fake, that they've created, but look like they work for defense contractors or telecoms and whatnot. And then they have a bunch of supporter profiles that really don't have much fleshed out in their profile, but they are linked in with these people. So they create kind of a web, and it looks like the leaders actually have lots of people that they're linked in with, so they look legitimate. So they're using these, they believe, or from their research, and this actually was reported by Eyesight Partners, I want to say back in 2014 somewhere.
Yep.
But this is an ongoing campaign. There's a little bit more detail provided in this report than I think Eyesight might have provided initially. Yeah. But in any event, they're targeting LinkedIn users, and they can kind of see by who's actually linked in with these leader profiles that are not supporters. They're like real people who's been targeted here. So about a quarter of them are in the telecommunications vertical. A lot of those are Middle East and North African mobile telephony providers. So it's kind of focused on that part of the world in terms of who's being targeted. There's also a smaller amount of those that are Middle East and South Asian government and defense organizations. So the other interesting corollary here is that they're pretty sure this actor set is also related to Operation Cleaver, which I think we talked about earlier in the year. Operation Cleaver was also an Iranian-based campaign using, and it was reported by Cylance, is the reporter of that one who wrote that report up. They used kind of a fake resume application program that was really like a Trojanized piece of malware in order to recruit victims and whatnot. And the reason they're able to kind of link that up is because the domain names used in the Cylance one, I have 3 various companies like Northrop Grumman, Teledyne, I think, and there was another one in there that I can't remember the name of. But it's the same, these fake profiles in this campaign are pretending to be part of those companies.
Oh.
In general, this is something you'd want to obviously be wary of. When you get LinkedIn invites, kind of verify, make sure that you're not linking in with somebody who's pretending to be someone that you know and really is that person. I don't really have good advice about how you would do that necessarily other than calling them, but that's
a little bit tricky, yeah.
It can be tricky, especially if you have a substantial profile, you know a lot of people and you're linked in with a lot of people. But it's not a new tactic. Like we said, there have been other cases I think we reported on. There was one where somebody had done
experiment.
they'd done an experiment as a
Wrong
pen
stage.
test, right, against a defense contractor where they had a attractive woman that pretended to be part of the company, and everybody in the company like linked in with her or accepted her invite, and then they actually were able to get a laptop by social engineering people within the company, their IT personnel. In any event, and also there have been recent cases that we discussed where targeted attackers are looking at the job postings at various companies, and then they'll send weaponized resumes in, a Trojanized doc file that has someone's resume, but it really drops a piece of malware on the machine. So, the HR department or whatever in your organization might get these resumes, and one of them might be a Trojanized thing like that.
Who would have thought the HR department is one that really is perhaps the most exposed in terms of being potentially, receiving a malicious file.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can't really block them, otherwise you'd be blocking the resumes. They have to be able to get to those.
And chances are, they might even just forward those right on to the actual, depending on the size of the organization, they might forward that resume on right to
it could continue on,
the part of the company that's actually hiring for that position, which might be where they really, whoever this target attacker is trying to get. So things to be really wary of and careful about as you're doing these social interaction type engagements out on the internet.
All right, very good.
Okay.
Interesting story.
So Matt, let's go to you. And we're frequently talking about denial of service attacks, but we haven't really talked about the subtleties of one mitigation service versus another, and how they might some might have advantages over others. So tell us what you found.
So there's a new tool out, and it's also accompanied by a research paper. The tool is called CloudPiercer, and it's a really fascinating tool from my perspective. I read the paper last night as sort of my evening reading, and I was hooked. But the whole idea is that in order to do cloud-based security, which includes things like DDoS defense and other types of man-in-the-middle for good, some cloud-based providers will use things like DNS in order to mask the IP address of what they call the origin server.
Right.
So you hire the company, you reconfigure your DNS to point to their servers so they can perform DDoS scrubbing, WAF, other services like that, and then it gets routed back to you. The problem is that it doesn't always completely hide the original IP address, that origin IP, and CloudPiercer is a tool that uses a couple different techniques in order to try and find that origin IP address. And some of these are pretty interesting. IP history is a big one. So if you've just changed your IP address, there are services out there that will have passive DNS, and they'll say this domain resolved to this IP address at this point in time. If that data is still out there, people can take a look and say, well, that's the old IP address. That may still be your server, and if it is, you're in trouble. So actually, some of these cloud service providers will ask you to change your IP address once you've signed up with them, so that's no longer possible. Things like subdomains, so if your mail server is the same as your primary server, is the same as some other service, something.yourdomain.com,
Right.
people can infer either the actual server or the IP range that your servers reside in, and from there can try and find out where your actual origin server is.
So if I understand correctly, the thing you'd be concerned about here is whereas the mitigation service is basically protecting what goes to the domain name. If somebody goes and attacks the origin server IP address,
It's all for naught.
then it's all for naught.
Exactly.
It could be bypassed.
So they list out a bunch of different techniques. I found each one of them pretty interesting, and they've got a tool that you can sign up for. You have to sort of prove that you own the site. But from there, they'll show you, where the leaks are that might point to your actual origin server getting attacked. Now, they're using DNS in these cases, and that's where the weak link kind of is. I believe that if you're using BGP, some of these go away because you don't have that DNS history or things like that. So if you're using like a cloud-based DDoS defense service, you might want to look to one that has BGP. It doesn't completely take care of all these problems, but it at least solves some of them.
Yep, absolutely. All right, very good. That's a I guess characteristic you want to look for in your mitigation service. That is, do they have the full repertoire of capabilities in terms of being able to redirect based on DNS? Sometimes I think that may be what you really want to do, or are there mechanisms for actually doing routing, which is sort of more ingrained in the infrastructure of the internet and much more difficult to bypass.
So there are definitely trade-offs, but we know that attackers have been using techniques similar to these. Some booters will advertise that they have a Cloudflare bypass or any of the other provider bypass as part of their service. So it's definitely being done. It's not just research at this point. It's for real.
Right. Okay. Very good. Well, thank you. John Markley, let's go to you. We'll talk. Let's talk a little bit about what Apple's been doing here and how that, I guess, the good and bad of it.
Yeah. So really, what the story is, and it was iMore probably is the ultimate source of this. What they reported upon is that Apple had removed some of the ad blocker programs off the App Store. If you're not familiar with the ad blocker, that was actually a fairly new feature coming out with iOS 9 that let you install things on your your Apple iOS devices to block certain content. And there's a lot of discussion about that speeds you up, right? Because if you remove the ads, maybe you go a little faster. So people have jumped on this technology, and so the issue here was that Apple has ended up removing some of these. And so what I really wanted to talk about is not necessarily what they did to the apps that they removed, but why. And it's all based on what they call root certificate. On a normal phone, you go to a website, you have both, and there's two streams here. One is the browser. It'll go connect to the server on the internet, and the other one's in your app. And they don't necessarily use the same engine to do that, but with normal connectivity, nothing really blocks it. So when you put an ad blocker on, it actually stops some traffic. So it looks at some algorithms, possibly a blacklist, and it'll block some of that traffic. Whereas they're still having the content that's necessarily the browser or the in-app. It's still going to get through. The key here that's probably a little tricky is that the bottom green arrow is designated the in-app connectivity. And when you look at in-app connectivity, there's not a lot of these ad blockers that block stuff that comes from within an app. So if you have an app that actually goes out to surf the internet and gets an ad, it's not going to get blocked by many of the ad blocker programs that are out there.
Well, in fact, that's one of the security features of the platform. That is, you want to keep apps separated from each other unless the permissions are, granted to be able to grant access across apps. And I think there are, some limitations in the controls that are available to you. But forgive the interruption.
No, you're absolutely right. And the key here is that there's some concern though that some of these apps could deliver you ads that you don't want to get. And so people are complaining that hey, my ad blocker is not blocking an app. I'm playing a game or I'm doing something. I'm still getting ads. So what has happened is on the next slide. What I want to show is one of the technologies that somebody chose to solve this with both apps and browsers. Is they redirect you to a third party. So basically a proxy or a vetting process, and they do that by installing a root certificate on the device. And so what that means is that when your device needs to go verify that the connectivity is valid, it sends it to this third party, which is the cloud in the middle. And it'll say, okay, if I'm going to a bad site, based upon that third party, I'll stop it. If it's going to a good site, it'll go through. And because of this is a root certificate, it applies across the device unilaterally. The challenge here, and it's kind of the scary part, and this is why Apple chose to, say, let's relook at this technology, is you are having this third party vet all your traffic. And if they were to be compromised or have a problem on their site, all of a sudden, you don't have this, this protection that just having a normal default or normal vetted root certificate would have, for normal connectivity. So that's where Apple's kind of gone back and said, let's remove these apps, let's relook at this technology and maybe come up with a better way if you still choose to do this.
Yep, it makes sense. I guess it all comes down to your little cloud in the middle about whether, first of all, you understand what they're doing, which I would venture to say that 99% of the folks that are using these things don't really have a clear understanding of what that little cloud is doing, that third-party provider, and what the implications might be if they had a problem. So I think that would be sort of the first item. Do they realize their bank transactions are going through that third party, and should they really trust them for that? So that's, I think, an aspect of this. And then obviously the second aspect of it is, how do you decide which ones you should trust or which one you shouldn't trust? Perhaps a little bit by implication, the fact that the app is in the App Store kind of is a little bit of an endorsement. And so I suspect that was sort of where Apple was coming in. We evaluate the integrity of apps, not necessarily a third-party provider, right?
Correct.
Or a cloud application.
Yep.
This is part of the brave new world that we're going into. It's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It's just one of these things that one way or another we need to work it out over time.
Yeah, and some of the apps are saying that they're going to come back. They're not there. Apple removed them, but they're going to come back. So they'll come up with a different solution that that allows everybody to trust that that there's not going to be a problem down the road.
So this is a very interesting one, and it's going to be worth watching to see how this gets worked out, because it really is part of that transition to cloud. And how do you manage the trust in third parties and even understand what the implications of their services really are? So. Neat story. So this is an interesting one. We're constantly talking about IoT and the vulnerabilities of some of the devices out there that haven't really been what I refer to as they haven't really been prepared to connect to the internet. And so, Matt, tell us what's this little interim solution?
So this is not an official sanctioned interim solution by any means, but some researchers out there who have opted to remain nameless have released what amounts to IoT malware, except it's grayware. I wouldn't put the word mal in front because its intentions are good. And the point of the malware is, I'm going to keep saying malware, I'm just force of habit.
Good malware.
Good malware.
Do-gooder malware.
Great. Okay-ware. Palware.
Okay-ware.
Grayware.
The point of it is, anyway, is that it'll use the same kind of vulnerabilities that we've seen on all these devices, namely the weak passwords, weak default passwords. Connect to the device, log in, install itself, turn off Telnet, and put up a banner that says this box is infected with Reincarna or LF Watch or IF Watch. It's got several names, but I think the official one is Wi-Watch is what Symantec is calling it. So I guess that's what it's called now. But it also sets up a peer-to-peer network. And within that peer-to-peer network, it sends its own command and control of what amounts to, I guess, security detection code, and removed several of the popular families of these IoT malware. So in a way, it's protecting the devices by closing the hole that most people would use to infect it.
Which the malware often does as well.
Which is true.
Right.
So the authors have actually posted saying that they have no ill intention in doing this. They want to secure these devices, but the fact remains that it's not their devices. It's the name Reincarna, which is in the banner that I've seen for it, is a callback to the Karna botnet, which a couple years ago somebody did the exact same thing, but rather than patch, they used it for an internet-wide survey to scan the entire internet and then provide that data for public consumption. So I guess the big question is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Is it gray somewhere in the middle? I admire the intent behind it. I know these devices ought to get patched, but the fact remains that you're breaking into somebody else's system and installing malware, and I can't really categorically be for that.
Yeah, so perhaps it gets into the subtlety of the definition of what we're referring to here as malware. That is, there is the getting into the device, which in an authorized manner, you have. I mean, there have been subtleties around that. If you don't set the password, is it really?
Well, that's. I mean, if you're using everybody else the same keys as everybody
Right.
else, is that you're still breaking in when you try the lock? And probably yes.
Yeah. So in any case, there are matters of principle here, and I suspect that there's a difference between managing the principles and the sort of the current legal structure that we have available to enforce those principles. So that's going to continue to need to evolve, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Now, do we know if there is any relationship between the folks that did the Incarna botnet and Reincarna? Is there, or is it just simply the
I don't believe so. And from what I've read from what the authors posted, they said that they consider themselves the spiritual successor.
Okay.
I think if they were the actual authors, they would have said this is version 2. Mm-hmm. So
Because there is similarity there. There's the peer-to-peer botnet. There was some.
Yeah.
I mean, the peer-to-peer command and control was a characteristic of the Incarna botnet that we had reported on for quite some time. So, all right.
Did they give
this
any
is-
details on that P2P protocol?
they did not, but what they did do is they shared the entire code online. So if someone wants to
So
go and take a look at how it works,
implied details.
they can do
Yeah,
that.
so you could probably figure it out.
Well,
All
that's-
right, I was just wondering if there's certain ports and protocols it's using to communicate that we could look at for the internet weather.
Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. So we'll see if we can investigate that further and get some idea. Because ultimately now they are in a competition directly with the malicious actors. And it's a matter of how cleverly they're able to actually identify the
The malicious activity.
the maliciously infected devices and try to overtake.
It's difficult to tell intent sometimes from packets. I think in the internet weather, we're going to have the telnet port that they're using. It definitely figures in this week. So
All right, very good. So, so there are these IoT devices. John, I guess, picked up a little bit of a strange flaw with.
Yeah, I wouldn't consider this an IoT thing,
No.
but so I just want to make, this is a Cisco, I guess it's the Cisco ASA appliance that does, it's a clientless VPN. So a lot of companies use this. It's basically, you go to a HTTPS web page and you can log into the VPNs. They'll deliver like an ActiveX control, or I think they have a Java option that actually gives you VPN connectivity, but you don't have to pre-install any kind of client, right?
That's convenient.
So, right, it's convenient. But that's not really where the flaw lies in this. So they had a bug. It was CVE 2014-3393 that came out last year in 2014. And Cisco did release a patch for this. So there's a patch has been distributed for it. However, not everybody has realized that they need to go update their appliances. So this is kind of an awareness thing, just to let people know that it is being targeted. This is a pretty good article from Volexity. It's worth a read. But the way it basically works is on the web portal, an administrator has the ability to kind of configure some options about like what's the title, what's the, what am I going to display on the web page kind of thing. Well, the ability to update that page and those settings, there was a vulnerability in a version of this
Authentication
software.
bypass.
Yeah, so you didn't have to authenticate, but you could update and set something in there. So what the attackers were doing is they were just injecting a little thing that says, load this JavaScript from my website over here. And what that did is when a user would go visit the VPN portal for their company, it would inject that JavaScript, which was a keylogger that was just looking for the login and password when the user typed it in, and then it would record that information. Not particularly good if you have that happen to you, because then an attacker could potentially get access to your VPN as a real user, look like they're connected like a regular user because they've stolen the credentials. So they've observed a few verticals here: medical, think tank, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, those kind of ones that try to do good things, I guess. Universities, academic institutions, multinational electronics. They also noticed a lot of targeting against Japanese governmental sites, as well as high-tech companies within Japan.
Choice. Okay.
So that's interesting. Another interesting aspect is there's some connection with some of these domain names. So when they would inject the JavaScript on some of these ones that they saw, the domain names used there had been used by actors that use PlugX. The PlugX malware, which is well known, is a Chinese nation state type of oriented malware family. So that's a little interesting corollary there. Another important factor is if you do have this and you're running an older version, you would want to check to see if you've been Trojanized with this injected JavaScript, because even if you upgrade, it won't remove that. Right. So if you upgrade to the new version, it's still going to have that in your settings and still display it to users. You need to like kind of clean that up as well, in addition to upgrading your software. And then the other question that some people think, well, what about two-factor authentication? If I use two-factor, like a token, RSA token or whatnot, that should eliminate this problem, right? But the reality is no, because there's the opportunity to do session cookie hijacking. So they could just as easily, instead of grabbing login IDs and passwords, grab the session cookie that they delivered to you as an authenticated user, and then pretend that they're that person and connect through. It
depends on the token usage, but
possibly. But I think you would still get a cookie. Like if you logged in with your RSA token, you're going to get a cookie back from the Cisco ASA appliance. And me as a bad guy could go take your cookie and I could just pretend I'm you and pick up from that point forward. Also, you could just easily, if you're right there watching kind of real time, you could do token theft or reuse. Like I could just intercept and then come in as you.
Did they say that the JavaScript that was found in the wild was actually doing token theft or session theft, or
No.
is it saying it's a possibility?
That's a possibility, but I don't think they actually observed that. They mostly observed the login ID password type harvesting.
Okay.
okay.
Something to be aware of if you, if you have that type of appliance, to go check out your enterprise.
Well,
make sure
and to keep it up to date,
there.
because they do have that patch that's been patched for some time, right? So
Yes.
Yep.
Patch has been available for about a year, probably, I would say, but there's still some victims out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as we've always said, we've talked a lot about in terms of mobile devices and your home computers, but servers and appliances need to be patched as well.
Right.
So, invariably, all software has flaws in it. It's a matter of when they come to light and whether they get exploited like this in a security sense.
Right.
And so we all sort of stub our toes along the way and need to be able to be able to fix that up. So I guess that was perhaps a little bit of a toe stub for Cisco, but perhaps you have a little bit of a victory here.
Well, yes, Cisco actually has a pretty interesting victory here. So Cisco has a team, Talos, that does some pretty interesting stuff in terms of taking down bad guys on the internet and doing interesting research. It turns out that they actually took action with a provider called Limestone Networks in order to take down a significant portion of infrastructure around the Angler exploit kit. And they have a write-up on the Talos site, and it's really cool. I learned more about Angler than I'd ever known before. And actually, I think Talos learned more than anyone had previously known about Angler outside of the guys that were running it. Turns out that Angler, aside from being a regular exploit kit and delivering exploits, actually used proxy servers to pass people through to a single exploit server on the back end. So any of the servers that you may have directly communicated with if you were a victim were actually proxying the traffic back to a single exploit server. And there was also like a stats server and a master server behind that, and a number of these were all hosted on Limestone. Talos figured this out, contacted them, and worked together with them in order to effect a takedown. Apparently, I hope I'm quoting this right, 50% of the Angler exploit kit traffic was a single user of Angler on Limestone's networks that was responsible for $30 million worth of ransomware. So Angler was being used to deliver those ransomware kits, CryptoWall and TeslaCrypt, I want to say.
Okay.
So pretty interesting stuff. There's a lot of good details in the report as to the different URL patterns, how they changed over time. And I think it just score one for the good guys in general.
Did they mention if there was any law enforcement interaction with this takedown effort, or was it just on their own?
They did not mention in the article. So it's possible something was happening on the back end, but they didn't speak about it.
Okay.
What they did say, which I think was interesting, is Cisco's actually coming out with a new sort of service for, I think it's called Apsys, I just read about it today, where they do the same sort of, we come in and take a look at your data centers and figure out what's going on and try and help you clean up your act if you're a provider like Limestone.
Oh, interesting.
So that seems pretty fascinating. I don't know what maybe they've got the playbook from Limestone and they're just going to run it on anybody else they've got, but it sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, we'll see how that plays out. I think it's very positive that they're taking the initiative and doing this type of activity, because it is definitely good for the internet as a whole. And perhaps we don't really emphasize this, but figuring out exactly what's going on behind these malicious activities is really not a trivial activity. That is a significant analysis to be able to determine, what's going on behind the scenes and be able to trace it back to the foundation infrastructure that supports this. If you take out all those proxies along the way, it really doesn't do anything for you if that foundation infrastructure is still in place. So
Exactly.
hopefully, we'll see how resilient the fix here is, and hopefully it'll be. I guess the other thing to sort of note about this is it kind of emphasizes or exemplifies the complexity of the ecosystem associated with this. That these folks have stood up an infrastructure that was complex in itself to facilitate distribution of other malware on systems to be able to facilitate other business areas. So it really has gotten to be a sophisticated.
It's a business, and people with IT experience are fueling a lot of these schemes.
And lots of outsourcing.
So,
So, in any case. All right, so thank you for doing that, Matt. Now let's, John, why don't you walk us through, and I guess, again, in the spirit of the National Cybersecurity Month, walk us through some of these questions.
Right. So what I've done is I guess I needed to wear like a quiz hat or something, a wizard hat or something of some kind. But what I did is I put together about, 5, ranging from easy to a little bit more difficult questions just kind of for entertainment's sake, I guess, but also educational. So question number 1 here is the term internet, and it refers to A, the inner lining of a swimsuit, B, a computerized safe zone.
John.
Yeah.
I got this one here.
You do? Okay.
I had to chuckle when I saw the inner lining of a swimsuit.
that's the internet.
Right. The internet.
Right. It's the internet.
Right.
Yeah, but if you have to spell it out. There's a T.
I know what the actual. I'd like him to finish it, but I know what the answers are for each one.
All right, go ahead, John.
No, I was going to say, and actually, I did plagiarize a from some other source, so it's maybe extra points if anybody can name the source. Then, of course, C, a global connection to connected networks, or D, what happens to a volleyball that doesn't clear to the other side? Obviously, internet.
Oh, that into the net, yeah.
So what is it, guys?
Well, it's not the internet. It's not into the net. And then B, a computerized safe zone might be the intranet, but it's not necessarily safe.
I wish the internet was a safe zone.
Yeah.
So it's
I was thinking more like the E, the danger zone, the computerized danger zone.
the danger zone. All right. So I'm going to go with C. Final answer.
Okay, C, final answer. I think we all agree on this
Yeah,
one.
I think you got that one.
I think these get harder as we go, though.
They do, though there may be a little even more controversy down the road. Question 2, in computer security, the term CIA often refers to the A, Central Intelligence Agency, a B, a certified information accountant, C, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, or D, computer integrated attack, or another choice.
Well, John, I think any one of these could apply, but for all the folks that have done CISSP, I think the answer is pretty obvious.
Option C again.
Yep.
It's
Yes.
obviously
Although-
it's
I would think a lot of people like to think that the Central Intelligence Agency has something to do with computer security, but probably not the case.
yeah, probably not the case.
All right, so that's right. Good job. With C. Question 3. This one's a little tricky. How many devices does it take to be considered a botnet? A, 1, B, 2 or more, C, 100 or more, or D, thousands?
Oh, geez.
Well, on this one, John, I'm going to have to opt for E, but I'll let others do their input.
I'm going to guess B, just by the
think it's B?
definition.
Just
That would
by
be
the-
my guess, would be
Because it-
B.
Yeah, there's something arbitrary about 100 or thousands, right?
Although I think if you've got a botnet of 2, you shouldn't go around calling it a botnet. People will laugh at you.
Right.
People will laugh at you. I think just by the notion of net being in the term, if you have a net, you have at least 3 points. Because otherwise, think of a physical net. If you don't have at least 3 points, it's just a string.
Well, then maybe B is wrong, because you have to have a controller.
Well, I'm going to say E. It has to be 3 or more. But I think in the
what is
spirit
the
of
correct answer?
2 or more is probably a reasonable.
Two or more is a correct answer. A lot of people might say A, but of course A1 would be a bot. It wouldn't be a network. So that's
Right.
Yeah. So I think you hit it right on the head. You know, you can't just have 2 because unless one of the 2 is the controller. So yeah, it's B is probably the best answer.
All right.
All right. Question 4. Jailbreaking and rooting refer to A, escaping prison through a self-made tunnel, B, providing illegal data, C, stealing credit cards, or D, modifying a mobile device to enable non-standard actions.
I was thinking this is something that that a groundhog does. That is, breaks out of his cage and then goes rooting under your
through
shed.
my yard.
And A
Causes it to sink.
is jailbreaking, but it's not rooting. And B and C, I don't really think are related. It's probably D, but honestly, I think you'd have to put in something about gaining root access to the system itself. Non-standard could be, I don't know. It's a little bit too vague for me. I'd want to put something else in there.
Yeah, rooting actually it predates mobile devices, right? Gaining root access to a machine.
Yeah,
Probably comes from
True.
Unix, I would think. right?
Jailbreaking is kind of something. I think that's
That is a
generally.
mobile
I think
device.
that's the thing. It gets used so differently because most people, when you're speaking in iOS, they'll call that jailbreaking. In Android, everyone refers to it as rooting.
Right.
So
There you go.
But I think they're synonymous in this context, right?
I think you're right.
Yep. I think you got D.
That's-
D sounds like the choice, and you guys are right. Okay, good job, gentlemen. All right. So question number 5, the last question, a little harder. Threw a little technical one in here. A primary difference between triple DES or 3DES, depending on how you want to refer to it, and AES is A, triple DES uses 64-bit blocks. AES uses 128-bit blocks. B, triple DES use 64-bit encryption keys. AES uses 32-bit encryption keys. C, triple DES is unbreakable. Or D, there is no difference.
DES was the standard prior to AES, and that actually had a 56 or 64-bit key mode. In this particular case, triple DES is basically stringing together 3 DES encryptions in a row. So
overlaid or whatever.
if you do it properly, you'd use 3 different keys associated with that. So I would say 192-bit, but nevertheless, AES is the standard now. You could use, and I think it's probably accurate to say 64-bit blocks. Were you referring to the key there, John, or is it just the? You're referring to the.
You just got out technicaled.
I gotta say,
I guess
wow.
I was
Brian,
thinking more in
yeah,
terms
it's
of
not
key.
supposed to
No,
be that hard.
you're talking about the encryption blocks.
Correct, the
So
encryption blocks.
Clearly, A is the answer, nevertheless.
And that is correct. Good job. Yeah, that was a little trickier, but again, AES is supposed to be more more secure, so it uses a little bit bigger.
I tend to think in terms of keys rather than the block size, but that is significant depending on how you're encrypting your data and how that could impact and things. All right, so let's take a quick look at the internet weather here. And first item here is scam probes on port 5060 TCP. John, I had to actually consult with you on this. Normally, I think typically
it's
session
over UDP.
initiation protocol, which is basically the call setup for voice over IP, is 5060 UDP, but it can be TCP. In fact, if you're doing things over the internet, that might actually be the better choice.
Yes. Well, in some cases, yeah. Especially if you're behind a VPN provider that doesn't allow UDP.
Right.
That if they're going to kind of.
Well, and then in terms of firewall rules, that
Right,
generally speaking,
right.
you're
Sometimes
better off
that
using
gets a hiccup, so they want to
TCP
have some
rather than
statefulness. But yeah, 5060 TCP is valid. I
Yeah.
also found it interesting that Germany is where you're getting most of these probes from. I'll refrain from why I find that interesting. However, there is a lot of fraud going on in the voice over IP space, so this is not surprising to me.
Yeah, so generally scanning around, looking for voice over IP gateways, seeing if you can bypass the authentication, or in some cases, the authentication requirements may be just missing, or
they're easily guessable. A lot of people set up these like asterisk PBXs or these other VoIP PBX platforms. They might set up phone extensions, right? So I've got extension 110 and 101 or 111, but then they make the password for it something simple like 110 or 111 or 12345, which you should have a more complex password. So there are a lot of tools out there for brute forcing that type of thing, so that you can become an extension on that PBX. And then use
SipVicious being one of those.
SipVicious is
Yeah.
one. I think we've covered that on the show in the past, but in any event, yeah.
Yeah. So if if you're interested in learning a little more about the tools that you should be protecting against, SIPVicious is one of the really popular ones that we've observed in use. Looking at the top 10 most probed ports, well, not very many surprises here. Port 23 way at the top. Perhaps some of that is associated with the botnet that you're referring to, the pseudo good, maybe not so malicious.
But you would think that would be going away, right? Because if they come in and they apply their malware, right, this Reincarna one, it's not going to be scanning for Telnet anymore.
They're still competing.
Well,
they're still competing
that's
with
true.
the
I guess they have to find the devices.
That is one thing I did not mention during the article, is that this benevolent malware actually doesn't scan. They're doing their scanning from some other central point. The authors did mention that. So this is not worming its way out through the network.
So ideally, we should see this. Oh, I lost my voice. We should see it go down the trend, right? Hopefully,
Not so sure.
if they, I don't know either, but.
Well,
and then if the users reboot I know we're really sidetracked, but if they reboot their routers, right, then that stuff's going to go away as well, and then it's vulnerable for somebody else to come back in.
That's exactly where I was going, is that you have to continue scanning, because as soon as somebody goes through a power cycle, all that stuff's going to go away. They're going to be vulnerable again. You have to come back in and patch it again.
Right.
From the beginning. So we're going to look at 23 a little bit closer in a moment here, followed by 1433 TCP. That's Microsoft SQL database. We'll look at that one a little more closely. 445 TCP. We're going to look at that one too. A couple of little interesting observations, nothing serious though. Followed by 22 TCP, that's SSH, port 80 TCP, and 443 TCP, obviously, looking for the websites. 21 TCP, that's FTP, 3389, remote desktop protocol, and then 1900 UDP, that's simple service discovery protocol used in reflective denial of service attacks. Scan probes on port 23 TCP, that's Telnet, if you didn't already know. There are tens of thousands of sources. In fact, I think up around, we're going to take a little closer look at it. I think we're up around, on average, around 90,000 sources, maybe just short of that on a given hour. So over the course of a day, it might be much greater than that. The most aggressive sources that we're seeing here are from China. In this particular case, I just sort of wanted to point out that is over the last week or so, there's been a sort of a spike in the probing activity on that port, and you can see sort of the other spikes that have occurred over the last 30 days or so.
Did you happen to get a chart of scan sources?
I do have a chart of scan sources a little bit later on here. Scan probes on port 1433 TCP, that's Microsoft SQL database. It's been in the rankings of the top 10 for a little bit of a while now. I just wanted to remind you of the, about say 50 days ago, there was sort of a bump in the activity probing on this port. It's kind of interesting that this one is really kind of spiky compared to some of the others. That's a little bizarre. I'm not sure what the reasoning is behind that, but the sources here, primarily in China. There are actually lots of sources, not lots and lots, it's hundreds, but predominantly from China, and then there are some in the US and maybe a little smattering beyond that. So it seems like there might be a little bit, somewhat of a systemic type issue that may exist that's causing this to have some regional bias, but I'm not sure quite what that is. Next one, scan probes on port 445 TCP. We've seen some spikes here, and I just sort of wanted to point out, we're looking at about 40 days worth of data in the primary graph. The spikes themselves actually appear to be denial of service attacks. That is, if you look at the trend over a long period of time, there's still that, for the most part, relatively subtle reduction in activity. But there have been, strangely, some SYN attacks. We don't see that many SYN attacks, and why somebody would choose to do a SYN attack on 445 TCP is not really clear to me, but it appears to be that's the case in some of these situations. Now, it is a little bit curious around the early September. There's a little bit of a dip in the activity, and then it sort of built back up again, and I'm not sure if there's maybe some sort of a worm in the background that's...
Looking at the patterns we're seeing there, they're fairly regular until that dip, and then there's...
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's definitely more sharper peaks after that dip.
So there's an explanation for this, but we don't have the full explanation. So if you have any insight to it, certainly we welcome your inputs if you do. Next item here is in terms of the most sources doing the probing. Port 23 really kind of taking the show here, followed by 445 TCP, and I guess most notably 22 TCP. A lot of these devices have SSH access, not necessarily, and sometimes they're just targeting Linux systems, not necessarily things, but just Linux systems, and SSH tends to be open more often than not to those systems. So taking a little closer look at port 23 in terms of scanned sources, we're looking at about 90 days worth of data here. And there is sort of a gradual increase in activity over the last 90 days. And of course, back in May, there was a pretty big jump in that activity. It's not at record levels yet, but it's certainly, I would think in terms of the trend, relatively at record levels.
Yeah, and it looks like it's still kind of
Still
on a
climbing.
slight
Right.
up incline here.
It still looks like it's on an upward
So
incline,
reincarnate is not helping,
well,
or at least
again,
not represented in this graph.
Right. Well, and in fact, that is pretty telling. That is, if they're using a separate scanning point, which would maybe a small number of addresses, relatively speaking, rather than worming out, this would be an indication that that reincarnate is not entirely successful at grabbing access to these systems.
Right.
It may take a very long time for them to be able to gain access because they are waiting for that system to reboot in order to have it open up and actually be accessible. These folks have had the head start in actually being able to capture those
Right,
systems.
and how often do people's routers reboot? You know, that's
Not
the other
very
thing.
often.
So once they are compromised, you got to wait for something to happen, a power outage or some reason
Yep.
for that device to reboot.
Or the internet doesn't work.
Right.
You do that at
Right,
home,
right,
right?
yeah.
When it doesn't work, you hold the
My
button
wife
for a few
yells at me.
seconds.
Right. My iPad can't get to this website.
All
I'll
right.
reboot it.
On that note, that's our show for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at AT&TThreatTraq@list.att.com. And you can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel. It's on YouTube as well as on iTunes, just on audio version on iTunes, however. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at AT&T Security. So I'd like to thank you, John Markley, for joining us today. Thanks, John Hogoboom, Matt Kaiser. I'm Brian Rexroad, and we'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe. And one final note, keep an eye on the AT&T Cybersecurity Conference webpage. We'll provide a URL for you. And if you haven't registered already, go ahead and register. The videos from that conference will be available to you as well.